It wasn't a press conference. It was a detonation. The nation of Burkina Faso stood still as Captain Ibrahim Traoré appeared on screen, not flanked by ministers, not reading from a script. His eyes were sharp, his voice steady. What he was about to say would send shockwaves across the continent. Tonight, he began, I am speaking not just as a soldier, but as a son of Africa. He paused. Then dropped the hammer. We have uncovered irrefutable proof that President Alassane Ouattara is orchestrating the targeted killing of his own people. Gasps rippled through the broadcast. Reporters froze mid-sentence. For decades, the Ivorian regime had operated under a veil of Western approval, but tonight, the veil was torn. Behind Traoré, screens lit up. First, blurred images of mass graves. Then, heat maps of troop movements deep inside Côte d'Ivoire. Finally, the chilling part, intercepted voice recordings. A voice, identified as an Ivorian commander, spoke coldly. The president said, "Clean the sector." No witnesses. The silence that followed was unbearable. Traoré didn't flinch. He laid it all out, victim lists, satellite surveillance, tapped calls between top Ivorian officials, internal memos marked, presidential eyes only. And then the bombshell. We believe over 300 civilians have been assassinated in covert operations ordered from the highest level of the Ivorian state. This wasn't a leak. This was a direct accusation, broadcast to the world. But Traoré wasn't finished. He looked into the camera one more time and said, "If Africa remains silent while blood is spilled in silence, then we are no better than the colonizers who once ruled us. I will not be silent." That night, the streets of Ouagadougou roared. In Abidjan, they whispered. In Washington and Paris, they panicked, because, for the first time, someone had dared to say it, and back it up with evidence. The images weren't meant for public eyes. They were never supposed to leave the hard drives. Never supposed to reach a courtroom, or a battlefield of truth. But they did. And when Captain Ibrahim Traoré projected them onto a national screen, the world saw what had been buried, literally. First came the photos. Blurry at first. Then sharpened. Enhanced. Verified. Aerial views of shallow pits in northern Côte d'Ivoire. Graves. Fresh bodies, stripped, bound, mutilated. Some with hands still tied. Others with uniforms of student unions. Civil society tags. Pan-African movement pins. Then came the maps. Military drone captures. Heat signatures of midnight convoys moving from military bases to rural areas, and never returning. One dot on the map was circled in red. Next to it, Operation Vérité, Phase 3, execution site. And then, the audio. A voice, trembling, almost human, but empty. They talk too much. Eliminate them quietly. Don't dump them near the towns this time. The crowd in Ouagadougou didn't breathe. This was no smear campaign. No rumor mill. This was raw, cold proof. The documents that followed were even worse. Confidential memos, signed by Ivorian military officers, ordering civilian containment, with code language too brutal to repeat. Receipts. Timelines. Phone logs between Ouattara's top generals and Western consultants. Some documents even had foreign logos. One stamped with the watermark of a French private defense firm. Another linked to a US-based security advisor embedded in the Ivorian Ministry of Interior. It wasn't just an internal operation. It was an ecosystem of silence, protected by global powers, masked as anti-terror operations, and buried in classified folders. Traoré looked back at the crowd. "You are not imagining it," he said. "You are not exaggerating it. They are killing our people. And now, you've seen it with your own eyes." The crowd erupted, but not in chaos. In clarity. Because now the truth was visible. And that made it undeniable. The question hit like a hammer. Why them? Why these victims, these towns, these students, these activists? Captain Traoré didn't need to guess. He already knew. And now, the world would know too. He explained it clearly, calmly, like a surgeon revealing a hidden wound. The victims weren't criminals. They weren't foreign fighters or bandits. They were Ivorians. But they shared one dangerous thing in common: they believed in a free Africa. Traoré revealed names, faces, stories. A 22-year-old student leader from Bouak disappeared after organizing a conference on Pan-African sovereignty. A journalist in Yamoussoukro, arrested for investigating French military presence near cocoa plantations. A village chief, executed after refusing to sell ancestral land for an oil exploration contract. One by one, their profiles formed a pattern. They were young, educated, unarmed. But they had ideas. And that made them dangerous. Because to a regime built on Western dependence, thought is rebellion. Questioning is treason. Pan-Africanism is war. Traoré didn't mince words. They are targeting the thinkers, the connectors, the seed planters, because they know the real revolution does not begin with bullets. It begins with truth. He pointed to a chart. At the center, a map of Côte d'Ivoire. Radiating outward, pins marking every known disappearance. And on each pin, a note. Suspected Pan-African sympathizer. Known AES supporter. Spoke against French military policy. This wasn't random. It was systematic. A cleansing, not of armies, but of voices. And worse, some victims weren't even political. They were family members, brothers, sisters, killed not for what they did, but for who they were related to. This is not leadership, Traoré said. It is fear. And fear that kills must be exposed, before it spreads across Africa. People began checking their own streets. Their own governments. Their own silences. Because if it happened in Abidjan, where else was it already happening? The footage was damning. But what came next was treasonous, to the world order. Because Traoré wasn't just pointing fingers at Ouattara. He was aiming higher, at the ones behind him, beside him, above him. The West. As the screens behind Traoré shifted, new evidence appeared. Not from inside Côte d'Ivoire, but from Paris, Washington, and Brussels. Leaked diplomatic cables, between the Ivorian presidency and French defense contractors. Audio from a private security consultant, with a U.S. accent, giving advice to Ivorian generals. Keep it quiet. Don't let it get to the press. Emails from a European Union delegation, acknowledging reports of civilian casualties, but insisting on non-disclosure, for regional stability. Traoré turned to the camera. They knew. They saw. And they said nothing. Not because they support peace, but because they funded the war. And then, he named names. A French military base near Yamoussoukro, used as a logistics hub for anti-dissident operations. An American NGO, secretly supplying encrypted radios to pro-regime militias. A European oil company, funding security infrastructure in regions where activists went missing. This wasn't complicity by accident. This was a network of support, disguised in diplomacy, draped in aid, and soaked in blood. Traoré's words cut deep. They say they promote human rights, but their silence is soaked in African graves. They say they defend democracy, but they fund dictators who protect their contracts. It wasn't the first time the West was caught standing behind a tyrant. But this time, they were standing in full view. And Traoré made one thing clear. If we allow killers to hide behind embassies, then we are still colonized, not with chains, but with lies. That night, African youth began connecting dots. What else had been covered up in their countries? Who else was being stabilized into silence? Traoré hadn't just exposed crimes. He had exposed a system, and lit a fire beneath it. It happened quietly. No cameras. No aides. No press. Just a single room, in a military facility deep inside Ouagadougou, and two men who risked everything to be there. They were former officers in the Ivorian Republican Guard. Trained by foreign instructors. Trusted by the regime. But what they saw broke them. They slipped out of Abidjan in the dead of night. No passports. No phones. Just a flash drive, and the truth. And now, they sat across from Captain Ibrahim Traoré. Eyes down. Hearts heavy. One of them, a major, spoke first. We were told we were protecting the state. But we were cleaning blood. What followed was a confession. They spoke of black sites. Hidden detention centers in Côte d'Ivoire's forests. Interrogation rooms, run by private contractors. Civilian executions, disguised as anti-terror raids. We buried activists in unmarked graves, one of the men whispered. Some were still alive. Traoré listened, no emotion on his face. But inside, a storm was forming. Then they handed him the device. A simple flash drive. But on it, over 60 gigabytes of classified military files. Chain of command. Kill orders. Body counts labeled non-military losses. Communications with Western security consultants greenlighting eliminations. Photos. Videos. Names. Hard evidence. Proof the regime was not acting alone. Proof the killings were coordinated, planned, and protected. Traoré didn't speak for a full minute. Then, he turned to his intelligence chief and said, "Verify everything. Then prepare the broadcast." This was no longer a political scandal. It was a continental crime scene. And for the first time, Africa had both the witnesses and the receipts. The two officers were granted asylum. Placed under 24-hour protection. Not from the streets. But from the foreign hands that might try to silence them next. Because what they carried wasn't just information. It was evidence, strong enough to shake a regime and expose the empire behind it. By dawn, the evidence had gone global. Screens across Africa lit up with images once hidden in encrypted folders. The voice recordings. The graves. The Ivorian documents, stamped with blood and betrayal. And then came the wave, not of mourning, but of fury. But it didn't come from Paris. Not from Washington. Not from Brussels. It came from Accra. Dar es Salaam. Bamako. Lusaka. Addis Ababa. Everywhere, but the West. In Abidjan, young Ivorians flooded the streets. Not just in sorrow, but in rage. "Stop killing us," banners stretched across university gates. Mothers marched, holding photos of sons who vanished without trial. Journalists finally spoke of stories they were once too afraid to publish. Africa's youth knew, this was no longer just about Côte d'Ivoire. This was about the system that allowed it to happen. And in Europe and America? Silence. No statement from the White House. No condemnation from Macron. No emergency meeting at the UN Security Council. Why? Traoré gave the answer himself, staring into the camera, fire in his voice. Because the killers were trained in your camps. Because the equipment came from your factories. Because the silence is profitable. CNN called the evidence unverified. Reuters said the situation was complex. French media focused instead on security cooperation in the Sahel. They weren't confused. They were complicit. And as Western journalists dodged the truth, African bloggers, activists, and truth-tellers rose. On TikTok. On Twitter. On WhatsApp. Expose the empire. Justice for Ivory Coast. Traoré was right. He didn't need the West's outrage. He had something stronger. A continent waking up. And refusing to unsee what it had just seen. The silence from the West wasn't neutral. It was a message. And that message was now clear. We don't care who dies, as long as our contracts live. It began with a whisper. A strange pattern on security cameras outside Ouagadougou. 3 men, moving at night. No uniforms. No IDs. Just suitcases, and silence. They claimed to be traitors. But something was off. Burkinabe intelligence let them roam. They watched as the men scoped out communication towers. Tried, and failed, to access a military outpost near the oil zone. Entered a cyber cafe and plugged in a suspicious USB stick. That's when Traoré gave the order. Bring them in. Don't wait for the sabotage. They were arrested within minutes. No resistance. Just cold eyes, like men who had been caught many times before, and always walked free. But not this time. Inside their luggage. Burner phones. Encrypted flash drives. Printed maps of military facilities. A forged security badge from Burkina Faso's Ministry of Defense. Under questioning, they cracked. All 3 were Ivorian operatives, trained in Abidjan. Sent across the border on a mission. Their target. Destroy the evidence, especially the leaked audio. Identify and eliminate the 2 military defectors. Discredit or disable Burkina Faso's next national broadcast. They were part of Operation Lips. A covert mission. Sanctioned by top Ivorian officials to neutralize the Traoré threat, the confessions were caught on camera, and when clips of the interrogation were broadcast, the reaction was immediate. Africans across the continent realized something deeper. This wasn't just political warfare, it was a regional shadow war. A frightened regime had crossed borders to silence the truth, and now it had been caught red-handed. Trembling, Traoré stood before the press and said, "You came with silence. You came with lies. You came with your knives in the night. But we are wide awake." The spies were detained under military law, their identities made public, and the message to Abidjan was crystal clear: the truth will not be buried, not in your soil, and not in ours. He could have stopped at exposure. He could have let the world talk, debate, and distract. But Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't come this far to make noise. He came to make history. So in a packed press hall, flooded with microphones and flashing cameras, he stepped forward and made his demand, loud, clear, and unforgiving. Alassane Ouattara must stand trial. For crimes against his own people. For state-ordered murder. For betrayal of the African soul. A wave of silence swept through the room. Journalists lowered their cameras. Even seasoned diplomats blinked, because this wasn't a press stunt. This was a formal declaration of justice. Traoré listed the charges: crimes against humanity, abuse of state power, political assassinations, concealment of mass graves, complicity with foreign actors in the suppression of civil resistance. Then came the bombshell: Burkina Faso would submit all evidence to the African Court on Human and People's Rights and demand an international tribunal, backed by neutral African nations, far from Western influence. But this wasn't just about Ouattara. Traoré looked directly into the camera, eyes burning. Let every dictator across Africa hear me. Let every traitor in a suit, hiding behind foreign embassies, listen closely: we are coming. Not with guns, but with truth. And this time, the truth will not end in silence. It will end in judgment. The room erupted, not in chaos, but in thunderous applause. Across the continent, the announcement lit a fire. In Togo. In Gabon. In Congo. Citizens asked, will our killers face trial too? In Kenya, a trending hashtag surged, #TryThemAll. Traoré wasn't chasing vengeance. He was building a precedent. For too long, African blood had been spilled in silence, covered up in the name of stability, economic partnerships, and national security. But now, someone had pulled back the curtain. And once justice had a name, it would demand a face. Abidjan was cracking. The city once praised as a symbol of Western-backed stability was now boiling with unrest. What began as silent fear turned into mass resistance. The moment Traoré called for a trial, the Ivorian streets answered, not with panic, but with power. Tens of thousands took to the streets of Yopougon, Bouak, Daloa. They held signs that read, "No justice, no peace." Photos of the disappeared were taped to government gates. Chants echoed through the alleys, "What murderer hides from truth? Truth will not be buried." Universities went on strike. Civil society groups formed citizen tribunals. Even soldiers, young, frustrated, disillusioned, began to break ranks. Anonymous statements leaked from the barracks, "We signed up to defend the people, not silence them." And then came the real fracture. A brigade of elite commandos, once fiercely loyal to the regime, publicly announced they would no longer serve a president accused of killing civilians. The Ivorian military was splitting. Inside the palace, Ouattara was cornered. His ministers argued. His foreign allies stopped picking up calls. Embassies issued evacuation warnings. Even France, his oldest protector, went quiet. Not because they supported justice, but because they smelled collapse. The regime, once armored in silence and money, was now surrounded by truth. And truth, when armed with evidence, with people, and with history, is unstoppable. Across the border, Traoré's warning echoed again. If they refuse to hold him accountable, the people will. The world must decide, will there be justice, or will the streets deliver it? International news anchors danced around the words, civil unrest, political instability, growing discontent. But the people knew better. This wasn't instability, this was justice breaking through the cracks. And Alassane Ouattara? He wasn't just under pressure, he was standing at the edge of something he couldn't control. A reckoning. One born not from foreign invasion, but from within. It started in Côte d'Ivoire, but it didn't stay there. Traoré's truth had done more than expose a dictator, it had awakened a continent. From the dusty streets of Nima to the bustling markets of Lagos, from Kinshasa to Nairobi, a single cry began to rise. Enough. Enough of the silence. Enough of the fake elections, the rigged deals, the disappeared activists. Enough of leaders who bowed to foreign capitals and bled their people dry. In Bamako, youth flooded the streets with photos of their own missing brothers. In Togo, soldiers refused to break up protests, joining them instead. In Senegal, civil rights lawyers called for an African tribunal that would try all tyrants, not in The Hague, but on African soil. If they kill us for dreaming, one young protester shouted. Then we will rise as a million more. Traoré's message had started as a spark, now, it was a wildfire. He issued a statement broadcast across the continent. We do not rise to burn, but to rebuild. We do not rise against nations, but against the system that devours them. This is not a Burkinabe fight. This is Africa's moment. In Abidjan, Ouattara's regime was collapsing. His inner circle splintered. Foreign diplomats quietly boarded planes. But what no one could stop was the awakening. Old flags were torn down. New ones rose, not of countries, but of values, unity, justice, sovereignty. And across it all, one face stood above the rest. Not on posters paid for by billionaires. Not in suits sponsored by global forums, but in fatigues, with a rifle slung over one shoulder, and a nation behind him. Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He had done what many feared to try. He had told the truth. And he had proven, the truth, when armed with courage, can set an entire continent in motion. The Pan-African uprising had begun. And this time, it would not be televised by the West. It would be written in the streets, in the hearts of the people, and in the pages of a new African history.